Hello and welcome. It's Alexa Linton here, your host for the Whole Horse Podcast. We're here to look at all the ways that the horse industry is changing before our very eyes in very cool, very amazing ways. And we're chatting with the people at the forefront of that change, the professionals, the trainers, the body workers, the researchers that are helping our lives with horses become better and better. Thanks for being here. I love that you're here and listening and learning. And if you ever have a guest that you want to suggest or a topic that you want to hear, just let me know and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. It means a lot. And I look forward to seeing you for season 4. Hi, everyone. It's Alexa Linton here, and you're here for the Whole Horse Podcast. And today on the podcast, I am very, very excited to be able to chat here with Kathy Sierra. Thanks for being here, Kathy.
Oh, thank you. Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So I was telling Kathy that I've had numerous people share that I need to check out her amazing work in pain science and look at her, like, all this research she's doing and amazing things she's doing in the horse world. So I finally did and went, oh my gosh, how have I missed this? So Kathy, I'd love you to share just a little bit about yourself and how you came to be doing this work in the horse world.
Okay, I always try to make this shorter, but I'm 64, so there's a lot of stuff that's happened that's kind of led up to this. But typical kid horse background, at least kid in the United States. We had our first horse when I was 12, I think, or 10. One of my uncles retired cow horses, and so that was my introduction to horses, and then had horses on and off throughout most of my life. And my university degree is in human kinesiology, so human biomechanics, exercise physiology, sports psychology, and I worked in that field for another 10 years in sports medicine, and then for a whole bunch of reasons, which did inform what I do with horses now, I could not handle being in that world any further. It was peak biomechanics when everything was about perfect, correct biomechanics. And I was working in Los Angeles for what was, I think, arguably the best sports medicine facility in the world. And we had every possible bit of the most perfect and adjustable biomechanics equipment that you could ever have for humans. And the best, exercise programming, everything was state of the art, and people were even more broken and messed up. Like, for every problem that we might correct, people would develop, 10 more. And my staff, I had 100 trainers working for me, and half of them at any given time would be wearing braces, casts. It was just, and I thought, well, if this is as good as it gets, and it's actually really awful, I just don't want to be part of this anymore. So I left, went back to school for something that I assumed would not cause damage to humans, and that was computer science. And stayed in that world, but because I was in Los Angeles, I ended up working for Hollywood and game design, which really informed what I do now with motivation. So everything was about the motivation side, what creates a truly engaging, empowering experience. And then I eventually led to my horse Dramer, who you might have seen, the Palomino, who, this is quite a number of years ago, but he was diagnosed with EPM, turned out misdiagnosed, but at the time he had stopped moving completely. And after a series of ups and downs, it looked like there's nothing that can be done for him. We don't know what's actually going on with him. And so it was a sort of dark night of the soul, trying to make the decision about euthanization. And I had one of those epiphanies the night before making the decision, just based on sort of chance, reading a couple of books at the same time. One was Xenophon, which I always went back to, just for inspiration. And the other one was a book on motivation for humans called Drive by Dan Pink. And reading those two together, that sort of, hit me at the side of the head and said, well, why don't I just apply all of the things that I know about humans? If all of the horse stuff that I could possibly do, I tried every possible thing, had every possible trainer. If I can't, then I'm going to apply what we know about human motivation and see if I can get him to recover even the tiniest bit of love for movement. Because once they stop moving completely, right? And I mean, even one step was a challenge for him. And he was 7 years old. So, I mean, and otherwise healthy, it seemed, right? But couldn't move at all, and was just dead to the world, like the most shut down horse you could ever imagine, that's somehow still alive. So I started on a whole different approach because I had nothing to lose, and that worked so well for him that it was just shocking to me. And then I had I was not a professional, nor am I a professional horse trainer, right? This is about my own horses. I have 6 now, although really 4 that are mine, 2 are my husband's. And I just kept wanting to see, well, where does this go? Like, if we get past rehabilitation, let's just see where it goes, right? And I just kept going and kept going and kept going. And then eventually other people would sort of see some of these examples of what I was doing with my own horses, and especially people who knew Dramer, who knew what he had been through, and my other horse as well. And I was competing in, Icelandic sport competition. So people were watching the progress of these horses and couldn't quite understand how that was happening. So I started to talk about it more, and then it was clear that other people, a few other people, wanted to learn more about it. And that's why I sort of gave it the name Intrinzen, and sort of clarified the science principles and what my approach was about. It's not a method or a technique or anything like that, but it's an approach based on science principles. And it's like, okay, you can apply these any way that you want. This is just what I do. This is how I've chosen to implement these principles. And I thought there might be, 20, 30 people in the whole world that would ever be interested in that, because I assumed they would have to be people as desperate as I was. And then, later it just grew over the years. It's been, 6, 7 years since I've first started to talk about it in front of anyone else. And now I think there have been like 40,000 people have downloaded my old ebook, and 1,000 students. So that's a shock to me that there are that many people who are interested. But yeah.
I'm not shocked at all, because I think so many people, have this sense that the way that their horses are moving is limited in some shape or form, right? And so to have a resource that can break them free of some of that resistance is a powerful thing. So I know I'm feeling it even for my girls. So
Right.
I would love to track back to, when Dreamer was in this process of recovery, and he went from no movement, to really starting to open up, and then performing and all these things. So what were some of those principles? I know I'm curious. I'm sure my listeners are as well.
Well, and I should say that in the beginning, for many years, it was really focused on motivation.
Yep.
And movement was just sort of a tool to get there. But today, I don't see those as being separate things at all. And so if anything, today, I'm more movement focused, and that just having the awareness of how motivation is impacted by that. But it's not about motivation anymore. It's much more about movement, and the motivation pretty much takes care of itself. So that's where I'm at now. Because even after I had started to do this, I was wanting to revisit some of my old human stuff, but not for the horses, just for human stuff. So I, reacquired some ancient certifications, right? And I was shocked at how much had changed in the human movement world, that it was drastically different from when I was involved in it. And that's another, we'll get to that a little bit later, but that's part of why it's been a little disheartening for me, because the human movement world has made these big strides. And yes, it was a huge struggle for them as well. And at all levels, right? Rehabilitation, physical therapy, coaching elite athletes, coaching kids, every sport, all over the world. But it hasn't really made its way to the equestrian world, or only a little. But so with Dramer, and again, this is just one example. So nothing that I do is a how-to, but this is an example of applying some of these principles. Is I wanted him to express something that would get him into a sort of a feeling powerful posture, like the power pose idea, getting his body into something where he could feel like, oh yeah, I'm a horse again. And so the only way that I could think of with that horse was basically, he knew what the clicker was. So we did positive reinforcement, which for many reasons had been a terrible idea for him, because he needed hardcore motivation to move. There's no way you could force him into it, right? There's no, if you tried to hit him, right, it would mean nothing to him. He would just shut down more. No one could force him to do anything. But no treats were enough either, right? If anything, he just started to lose motivation when it was about getting food. So I knew it needed to be an internal, intrinsic motivation that came from himself. So I had to find a way to try to get him to express it. But he did know what the clicker was. So basically, I just annoyed him. Like, I put a lot of really annoying pressure on him. Again, something that I haven't really ever had to do since, but not touching him, but definitely like shaking a whip behind him, and until he had a moment. And for him, it was just a fleeting part of a second where he like arched his neck and kind of pinned his ears at me, like, screw you, right? And I clicked. And I could just see his brain kind of go, wait, that doesn't make any sense, right? When they're used to this behavior of, you're going to reward me for what you want to see. And suddenly I was rewarding him for having this serious attitude and trying to get away from me, right? And he just sort of looked at me like, did you mean that? was that an accident? And so we did it a couple more times. And he just got it. So he just started arching his neck, right, and getting into this posture. And then within a couple of days, he was trying to do it in trot. And trot was extremely painful and difficult for him. So it was very shuffly. Like now he can do a pretty big, badass trot in that, awesome posture. But he could barely lift his feet off the ground. But he had the look. It's like he had the proud, sort of powerful pose, as though, I'm a war horse, right? Even though he had no movement to back that up. But I just kept reinforcing that, and he just lit up. Like, I hadn't seen him look like that since he was a 4-year-old stallion. Suddenly, he's there. And you could see him practicing it. Like, you could see him doing it out in the pasture and with other horses. And he just changed so dramatically in his case, right? This is not always the case, but for him, it was an immediate transformation. So it was really obvious that this was turned the corner for him. And then we just kept going in that direction. And I never had any sense that, and we'll be riding one day again or anything like that. It was just bringing him back to life through him expressing himself, good or bad, for himself. It was about what he wanted to be as a horse. It was no longer about what I wanted him to be doing or what I wanted him to do for me. It was like, what does he want to be? Okay, he wants to be a horse. That was my assumption. He wants to be a good horse. What does that even look like? What does that mean? It had been so long since he had experienced that. So that was his path. And then it just, kept going. And then I had another horse, Vavi, my Pinto, who I got because I thought Dramer wasn't going to survive. So then I was like, this is amazing. Now I have 2 horses. Of course, now I have 4, but Vavi was a very, I don't know what the word is, kind of the opposite of a badass.
Goody two shoes?
Yes. Yes. He was the horse that I wanted, which was, he'd just go along with what you wanted. And he had been a trekking horse in Iceland. He was afraid of nothing. He didn't want to work really hard or anything like that, right, in the conventional sense. But yeah, he doesn't like any drama. So he's not like sensitive and flighty. He would be like, I don't want the drama, so I don't want the fight. But he didn't ever interact or play with the other horses. He didn't engage, right? He didn't express himself with the other horses. So for him, he didn't really, in the same way that Dramer did, he didn't have this massive need to do this, but his movement, he was still is, he's a 5-gaited horse, which I don't know if you're familiar with gaited horses, but okay. So very pacey, very stiff in the body, right? It's very easy for them to, and so his movement was more and more restricted, mostly from my earlier training. And I thought, no, I want the same for him. I want him to just feel better about moving in his body and feel more like a horse, like a badass horse. So for him, if you just tried to intimidate him, right, he would just go, he wouldn't get into a proud posture and diss you. He would just kind of try to go along with what you did. So that approach wasn't going to work. So that's when I had seen some examples online of this thing that we just call chase the bag, of people, basically the giant cat toy. And so I thought, well, I'll try that with him. And that took him a while. At first, he just went, I don't understand the point, and I don't really care. And so, there was no switch that was flipped for him. So I just continued to work on his basic overall sort of posture and getting his back upright and, that kind of elevated base of the cervical spine, all of that. So at least he could kind of do the proud power pose standing, which is not necessarily useful, but it gave him a chance to practice that. And then every couple of weeks, I'd bring that toy out again. And finally, one day, he just got it. It was maybe 8 or 10 weeks later. The switch was thrown, and he realized he could just chase after it and stomp it and attack it. And he just, was like a completely different horse. And then the same thing, that once that happened, that switch, right? It wasn't overnight for him, but it was overnight after that moment. So once that switch was thrown, my husband the next day said, Vavi's down there, at the base of the pasture with the other horses, walking up to them and throwing his front leg out, like showing them, look what I can do, right? It's like he had forgotten, which, as a movement person, you'll understand, he had not touched that range of motion, which is a normal range of motion, right? But he hadn't touched that. His brain had not experienced it. His body had not experienced it for such a long time. So for me, it was like, all the mechanoreceptors are firing again. And he was like, I have a superpower. It's just called lifting my front leg and throwing it down. And that started everything for him. So that was his moment. And that was kind of how it all really began, because then I realized the Intrinzen part, because then I realized it wasn't just about, saving Dramer. It was also about encouraging more expressiveness, more exploratory movement, getting range of motion back in an active, not passive way, mobility, stability, right? You just suddenly see all of these things happening without any interaction from the person. Because, I already had long understood from my own background that, self-carriage means self, not not something you hold. So it has to be something where you're not creating it. You're not physically manipulating it, that they can carry themselves. And later, you can have tools and cue it, but you're not creating that carriage. They are. And so that sort of became the path that I took after that. And then, and that was the first thing I really helped people do. I made this ebook. It's not available right now, but this ebook on doing the crunches.
Yes, I was looking.
I have a video on YouTube about it that talks about how to do it. And that was kind of the first thing. And so that's the thing I think most people, even people who don't do any of the kinds of things that I do, a lot of people have experimented with that and have incorporated it into other things that they do. So that's where it all happened.
Amazing. Yeah, the crunches fascinate me, and maybe because there's going to be listeners that don't know what that means. What is a crunch?
Right, and it's a terrible name for it, but and some people call it power pose, and in a way, I think that it is. It's if you think of it this way, that for riding a horse, for example, although we do it even with horses that are not riding horses, but if a horse is going to be ridden, the thing they did not evolve to was carry weight on their back. And we know what their spine looks like, right? Their spinous processes are long and very close to touching. And so kissing spine is a super easy thing to have happen, where the spinous processes start to collide with each other. So if the horse's back dips under the weight of the rider, even a little, then just, stays that little bit of dipped, even though it's going to move while they're being ridden, but it's staying depressed, right? Their spine is now in extension. So the thing that the crunches does is it helps the horse actually learn to resist that downward pressure of the rider, pushing their spine into extension, into a dip. It's helping the horse learn to resist that and lift his back. But to be able to do that, a lot of people will do get that stretch by, a reflex, like tickling under the horse's belly or running the hoof pick or something, right? But we need the horse to be able to do it without being in response to pressure. Pressure underneath, right? We want the horse to actually move into pressure, actively move against the pressure of the rider. So it's just something that turned out to be pretty simple to teach the horses to do. And then just a slight weight shift back and really elevating through the base of the cervical spine, meaning, how the base of their neck attaches really low relative to their neck, right, in their chest. So what you see is you want to see the area around the withers and behind the withers poof up a little bit. Basically, if you've got that, if they're lifting up through the wither area, then you know that most of the other good stuff is already happening. So basically, we just teach the horse to do that on his own. And then we can start using it for what we really want to do, which is in movement, right? So standing there, that's kind of how they learn it, but the goal is to then be able to cue it, and what you get is basically like a half halt. So it's basically a self half halt, would have been a better word for it than crunches. But because it, in some ways it looks like an ab crunch, because they're using a bunch of things to do it, but we don't really care how they're achieving it as long as they're able to do it. We're not thinking about which muscles are we activating, and because it's about the capability to do it. So that means organizing it in their whole body in a million different ways in every possible movement. That's the goal. Mm-hmm. And then a little bit of a weight shift back. And then we used to also include lowering the haunches eventually so that it looked more, sort of like, if you know what a school halt is. But yep. So then flexing the hindquarters, and that I stopped doing many years ago. I mean, my horses will still do it, and if they learned it, they'll still do it. But I stopped teaching it as a standing exercise because the the lowering the haunches doesn't have any meaningful purpose to a horse standing. Like there's no movement reason to do that. And there's every reason not to. So I would say now kind of my overarching goal is that the movements they do should be authentic. And probably the only exception is standing there lifting the withers area. But everything else, especially a big thing like sinking in the hindquarters, lowering the haunches, flexing, right? They don't have a reason to do it standing. So instead, now the way we do it is we just give them a reason, any kind of a movement reason to do it. And one of them is if the horse is standing there and he's already shifted his weight back, and then we ask him to suddenly jump forward. If he has the ability to do that, like if that's part of your communication, well then just like us, right? If you're standing in your room with your legs locked, and I say jump up to the ceiling, you're gonna bend your knees first, right? You're gonna flex first, automatically. There's no one has to ask you to do that. It's not hard. It's the natural automatic thing you're gonna do to get the tendon reflex. So that's what we do. So if the horse is standing there and then you suddenly ask him to spring forward, he's gonna automatically flex in the hindquarters. So you're getting all of that for free. And then the other one that you've probably seen, which is, we call it the changed my mind game. That, the horse is along a fence line and you're just carrying maybe his food tray if you don't necessarily do, target training. You're just carrying his food and he's following you along the fence line. And then all of a sudden you go, oh, crap, I forgot something, changed my mind. And you turn around and you run the other direction, but he's trying to keep track of you because he thinks you're going to drop the food somewhere. They will almost always do a rollback, right? They'll sit back on their haunches, they'll spin, strike off at least one striding canter, right? It's the most common thing they do. So that one activity solves so many problems. And for some horses, it might take a while, just like it took Vavi for that game, right? It might take, weeks or even a few months before they finally actually realize, oh yeah, I can just go really fast. And we can reward that by, if the horse turns around really fast and tries to catch up with us, then we can immediately drop the food down and say, oh, yeah, okay, here's your dinner. but that one activity, you've got canter pirouettes, you've got both leads that they're going to strike off on, depending on which way you turn. So I guess you could call it sort of lazy training. It's what's the least I can do in their just daily activities, but that will create an experience where they automatically will just want to do these things. Not because they want to do those movements, but because they want the result of those movements, and it's just natural. So there's no work, they don't need to be motivated or anything, right? It's just, they're motivated by keeping track of you if you have the food, but yeah. So that
sounds like my kind of training right there. Kathy and I were chatting at the beginning about what it's like to be in winter on the West Coast here. We're like, oh, thank goodness the spring. It's solstice yesterday. So probably by the time this comes out, it will be solstice a few weeks back. So the days are now getting longer from here on out. Yeah. Which is wonderful. So Kathy, this is all, I love these little things that people can do easily. I think it's so great because I think we forget that we can actually do, like you say, lazy training in any moment. There's possibility for opening up movement and doing interesting things. On that note, I have the tendency, because I think because I'm quite maybe I'm slightly lazy, but I'm also a bit hummingbird-like. I tend to choose horses that are, draft crosses, pretty, like what I'm going to put it in quotation marks, could often be called lazy or behind the leg.
Yes. Yes.
You know the drill.
Oh, yes.
I've been with my mare Diva for coming on 19 years now. She's turning 23 in the new year. And I find her journey fascinating because she was that horse where she was 4 years old, and I could not get her, like, even a transition from walk to trot was like, oh, it was so, there was so much resistance in her body. Thankfully, and I went through my episodes of, I hate to say it on here, but wearing spurs and doing, like various things. And now she's really shifted so much in her body and her movement, but I still see the restriction. Just, it's always been there in her. And then in my new mare, and I share this because I'm sure there's people out there that might have some interesting things. She's got, pain and arthritis and side bone at age 7 in her front left coffin joint and navicular. And she goes through ebbs and flows of feeling good about movement. But she really loves to move. And she's that kind of horse that will rear if she feels like it, and really is quite exuberant in her movement. But, doesn't really, the balance and things, like if I ask her to canter in a circle, for example, she's like, just, just it's not a thing for her, really. Right. Whereas Diva's a bit more of that good girl, where she's like had so much natural horsemanship training over the years. Sorry, Diva, that it's the circle around forever.
Right.
And ever, you know what I mean?
They just get into that mode.
They just get in. Okay, that's what you want. So I would love to hear, what are some of the maybe principles or tools that you bring to the table with this kind of horse? I mean, because I think there's so many out there that really are taking on so much pressure and tension that is very unnecessary, I would think. Right.
So I think, like when you were describing your horse, it's Diva in the beginning, that going from a walk to a trot seems like impossible. And I know a whole bunch of us have experienced that. And if people haven't, they can't even imagine how uncomfortable and really awful that is. The feeling is horrible in every way, because you can feel how much their body and mind does not want to do this. And then you feel like you have to force them, or you do, right? Until that no longer even works. And it's inconceivable, I think, for people who have the sort of what they call the fire breathing dragons. And really all I had for so long were the very, the energy savers is the kind of way to say.
That's what I say.
Everyone else called them lazy, dull, behind the aids, right? But not non-responsive, right? But the energy savers. And then only now do I have a stallion that's actually, who not because he's a stallion, but he is the ultimate, he just loves to move, but he has all kinds of movement problems. He's the only one that actually is neurological. So I'll come back to that. But so with these energy savers, it's in many ways the same issue that so many humans have. And that's why the course I have now, I don't have the old Intrinzen course. I really just have the pain science course, because it's looking at, it's not the horse that doesn't want to move. It's the horse's nervous system that's trying to protect him from movement or from using resources. For a variety of reasons. Like when people say, oh, my horse just wants to dive for grass. And it's like, well, he's in a huge epic battle with his own brain saying, winter is coming. You need to eat this grass. And it's like we're fighting nature. And when the horse doesn't want to move and is resistant, I think people don't realize resistance for a horse. If a horse braces against you and you're trying to get them to do something and they're not doing it, right? That's also creating a painful, energetic experience for the horse. So if they're resisting something, that's taking even more energy. So a lot of times it's like, I think if their brain thought that this was not a bad idea, or at least their brain said, well, this isn't as bad. Moving is not as bad as what this fight is going to cause, in terms of using energy, in terms of, you might actually feel pain because of the whip or whatever. That there's something really serious going on with their nervous system is just saying, no, don't do it. And this is where, the human world has figured this out through all of this sort of revolution in pain neuroscience, which was a massive life change for me, because I had been kind of a very, very action sport athlete for a long time. I was a professional skateboarder, the ski team that, I had so many injuries, so many surgeries, so much arthritis in my joints for so many years. And I had done exactly what I think we see with the horses, even some of the young horses, for maybe different reasons, but all movement began to hurt. And pretty soon I was doing less and less of the things that hurt, right? Because there's this fear that you're going to make it worse. So I had lost my ability to do, for example, a full squat for 40 years, because ever since my knee surgeries, and I felt like it was going to just kill me. And it was like white hot daggers of pain. And then when I, went back to reacquire what had changed in the human movement world, and I started learning about pain science and the nervous system, I went, this is incredible. I'm going to try this on myself. I have nothing to lose. And I did. And within maybe 3 weeks, I had gotten back range of motion I hadn't had for 30, 40 years. And the biggest change was just, I think, being given the permission to move, like being told this healed as much as it was going to heal 40 years ago. You're not going to damage it further. That pain is not telling you it's damaging. It's telling you that you haven't done this for a long time, and maybe it might be risky, but the brain doesn't know, so it's going to stop you in advance. And the reason the brain doesn't know is because you haven't gone there. Mm-hmm. So how would it know that it's safe? And it hasn't felt you have that range of motion in your hips either. And we might as well look at your ankles while we're there too, right? So the whole kinetic chain, my movements had just shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. And of course, that's what we do when we put horses in stalls. And so as my range of motion shrunk, then that means that the maps in my brain of what movement my body is capable of, what movement every joint is capable of, had become low resolution, old style dial-up modem resolution, not, full HD. And a bunch of pieces were missing in those maps, just like my horse Vavi, who hadn't done a full range of motion with his front leg. His brain had no idea anymore that he could do that. So it was going to resist any movements throughout his whole entire body that might enable something like that. And of course, we all know that trying to make the horse do it just causes the brain to resist even more. And if we finally break through, that's why this idea of training with a lot of pressure, like, oh, the horse is resisting, and then we pull or we push or we press or we use the bit until the horse finally, quote, gives, then I'll see people say, well, now he gives now, he's trained, right? And it's like he just gave up a solution that the nervous system was choosing, which was to not bend that way under that pressure. And now that you made him give up that solution, his brain has to find another compensation. So we call that compensation whack-a-mole, right? You're just, the horse does one thing and then you don't see it, right? You know how movement works. 3 months later, why is that shoulder popping out, right? Why is he suddenly not taking weight? Why is he crooked in a new way, right? So the way we look at it is any, quote, problem the horse has is not a problem. It's the brain's best solution at the time. So we have to make the brain have enough credible information that the horse is safe to do these movements, to do what you ask, to use energy, to do all of these things. And then, and not by forcing them into it, because forcing them into it makes the resistance stronger from the brain, even if the horse learns behaviorally that he doesn't have a choice and he'll do the thing, right? So people like train a horse with force, with force, with force. Pretty soon the horse is doing all the movements, and then the person goes, but there's no expression. It's like, well,
or they're broken. They're broken. They got
no
injured.
Expression would be the best case scenario, right? They're broken. So it's about, how can we get them to rediscover movement authentically? And the easiest way is through their environment.
Oh my gosh, I have to tell you this aha that I'm having right now. So after I got Diva, one of my lifelong dreams had been to work on a ranch, like a cattle ranch. So when it was about a year after she came to me, a girlfriend of mine who I was in school with worked on a ranch in Alberta, and we shipped Diva all the way out. And I always thought, because I'd been working in energy medicine and various things at the time, and we'd been doing a lot of stuff, she changed completely on that trip because she loved working cattle. She had, there she is. She had so much fun. Makwa's making her podcast appearance. She had so much fun on the range, going down hills, going on adventures, seeing new things, moving. Exactly. She loved moving cattle. And I remember being like, wow, she's a different horse. She just came alive while she was out there. But now I'm thinking, of course she did.
I know. I think, to me, horses, like cow horses, that is kind of the purest example of a working horse with intrinsic motivation. Because, when a horse is actually working a cow, right, you can't micromanage that. No. You have to let them go. And you're basically kind of a passenger up there, right? And they're in their element. They know what to do. You're not telling them how to move their body, right? They're just, imagine someone playing soccer or football, for my European friends, and imagine if a coach was out there dictating every single way they move their body parts, right? It's absurd. We would never think that was possible or healthy. But yet somehow we got this idea that this was a good idea for horses, right? And so you see horses come to life when they're doing things that they understand what the purpose is, not what the trainer wants from them, but what the actual movement authentic purpose is. And then they're able to do it. And then it's, and it's also rewarding for them to do it on its own, right? Horses don't work cows because they're later going to get a treat, right? They work cows because inherently, some horses, I guess, are forced to do it, but most horses just, they come to life. And then other aspects of that lifestyle. And that, so if you have a horse that's a real energy saver, here's the paradox, right? The goal for me now with those horses is to increase the number of things, number of movements, speed, whatever it is, right? Speed, gait, for which the horse or the horse's nervous system can say, this is no big deal, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like the brain doesn't have to go, oh, should I? Winter's coming, we should save energy because we're going to need it, right? In the fall, Icelandic horses are growing, well, all horses, but Icelandic horses are growing so much fur. That's synthesizing proteins, right? That's burning a lot of energy. And, you can imagine the brain going, I don't have energy to spare for your little activities in the arena, right? So how can we make it so that the brain will say, well, sure, that's no big deal, right? When their brain we often experience their brain going, I can't, one step is going to be too much. So in the beginning, there's kind of that chicken and egg, right? How do you get them moving so that they can build up enough of their basic capacity so that it's no big deal? And for me, that's where those early weeks can be a little tricky. And like my horses have been on a break for a long time, so I'm still going to need to revisit that. Every year, my horses have such a long break that I go back to that again, right? But I've done it for so long that it's never a concern for me, right? I know how it works. So in the beginning, it can be very inconvenient for the human because the best motivation for a horse is usually another horse. So sometimes I have to get a little help, or I have to get help from another person, or, as much as I can, the environment. So I'll give you a few examples. And then usually horses, their exercise physiology, they gain and reacquire fitness much faster and easier than humans do. So it usually doesn't take nearly as much as people assume to get enough of the basics back. And so, for example, if you position one horse at the end of a straight track and now I'm going to give the disclaimer that not all of these would be safe to do. So everyone has to do these with their own safety in mind. But we're talking about the energy savers where, you'd be happy if there was an explosion of energy, right? Mm-hmm. But so, for example, you have two horses standing behind a gate and you turn one horse out, but you hold the other one back, right? And you can imagine if it's a fire-breathing dragon, that horse is going to be doing pee off and everything else, right? But we just want any little spark, right, from the energy saver. So things that you wouldn't normally easily do with the fire-breathing dragon, that's exactly what we're going to do. So you turn the other horse out, and hopefully it's a horse that will move out, right? And that horse runs off. Now, when I release this horse, he's more likely, not always, right, but he won't necessarily run all the way to the other horse, but you might get 2 or 3 strides of acceleration. And that sends a signal to their brain that's really important. And so I might use that technique. Another technique that I do use is, let's say you have an energy saver and the only time that you see them perk up is when you call them for dinner, right? When they know there's dinner. And because I have energy savers, I've made sure that they can trust this particular call. And when I give that call, they can guarantee that there's their little tiny bowl of supplements, which they think is, like crack cocaine. So, but they can trust it, right? That's the only time they will hear that sound. They can hear it. I can be loud. They can hear it from very far away. So since they're on my property, if I'm in the mode of getting them back into fitness, I will wait until I see that they are as far away as they can possibly be. Mm-hmm. And then I will call them. And because there's 4 of them, right, sometimes they'll all look up and wait for someone to make a break for it, right? And then usually they will all come running. So I'm guaranteed to get this little acceleration. So it's not so much about the total amount of walking. I mean, that does matter. It's about, do they have transitions out of faster speeds? Even if it's just for a very short burst, that short burst of acceleration is much more important than, say, 15 minutes of trotting at an average speed, right? I want those little bursts. So I will look as hard as I can in the first 2-3 weeks to see what are the most likely places where this horse might be tempted to go a little faster without pressure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because if I put external pressure on them, then that just makes them hate it even more, right? It's just associated with everything bad. And almost never does positive reinforcement work for that. I use it, but I don't use it in that way, because usually if you're trying to, click your horse for walking, then you click him for picking up the trot, then you click him for getting a faster trot, right? It rarely goes beyond a certain point. So that's why I don't use it in that way. I'm still using it, but not to try to slowly speed them up. I'm using it to start with them speeding up as much as possible, and then later they can come back down to more, medium speed duration work. I use external focus things. So if you have a horse on a straight track, and it's very clear that when we go to the end, we're going to stop, that can be really motivating. Going beside the horse on a bicycle, or I use the little utility vehicle, right, can often be very motivating the horse when they know you're going to get to the end. And at the end, there probably will be a stop and a treat. Yeah. Then even a very long track. So we're talking, 150 meters, even some of the most energy saver horses. If it's a straight track, So there's a fence on either side. They will go down that track if I'm also speeding up or with another horse. So if you have someone who can actually ride a horse and the other horse can go with you, right? All of those things. And that's a lot of work, a lot of extra trouble. But after, like I said, after 2 or 3 weeks of that, that's worth so much more than, we could sit there for months trying to motivate the horse. And often they just get more fit, but less motivated.
Yeah.
So that's how I start. I just use whatever I can in the environment. Hills are amazing. And a lot of people will say, yeah, but we don't have any hills. We live in the Netherlands. There's no hills, right? Whatever it is. So just a man-made hill. So if you have someone who has a tractor and they can just do a little cut and fill in a pasture, 20 minutes of work and you've got a small hill plus the dip from where they cut. And just even the smallest hill you can really use. You can use it where they stand sideways on it, where they point down, where they point up, where they go over the top of it. Those have, tremendous benefits for changing their brain's relationship to movement, because those are so destabilizing if the horse hasn't been doing it. And destabilizing is awesome.
Yeah.
That's what causes their brain to go, whoa, whoa. And, everything lights up. And now the brain has more information about unusual movements the horse can make. So, like the way the human sport coaches will put it is, with a nervous system pain science perspective, your brain isn't going to let you accelerate if it doesn't know that you're capable of safely decelerating. So it's not going to let you go fast if it doesn't think you're good at slowing down fast, or if it doesn't think that you're agile and can turn, on a dime. And, that's why the one thing that I think works for both the energy savers and the fire-breathing dragons. So a lot of times a fire-breathing dragon, if they're really tense all the time, that's also because their brain doesn't think they have good, healthy movement available. So it stays tense, takes the slack out of the muscles all the time, right? They're turned on all the time so that if something happens, they're ready, because they haven't been, their brain doesn't know that they actually can go from 0 to 60 fast. So that's why that changed my mind along the fence line is a great way for the brain to go, oh, if a predator were to come from this direction, I can turn and spin and go in that direction, no problem. And that might take 2-3 weeks. And the brain suddenly goes, wow, all of these movements that I was resisting, yeah, whatever, no big deal.
That's amazing. I really love that. And it's clarifying so many things for me right now. One of the things that I would do with Raven is I would go ride Diva around the big field, and I would go to the end, and then I would call Raven and she'd race across the field. Perfect. And then we'd trot down the other side and I'd call Raven.
It's perfect.
Yeah. And I have found that for her is really, there's no force, there's no pressure. It's like she's moving into her natural expression, in a free way. So it's cool to get that confirmation of like, okay, like that's actually a helpful thing to do with her. Okay.
Oh yeah. And a lot of people, certainly the horse culture that I was in was like, well, you shouldn't have to do that. The horse should just do it for you, right? He needs to learn to do it for you, but it's like, the more that you do that the horse doesn't have to do for you, but he's doing because he wants to, then it just becomes so much easier when you do ask the horse, because now it's no big deal, right? So it's like sort of the best, when people go, what's the best way to motivate a horse? And it's like, well, is to take motivation off the table, to make it so that he doesn't really need motivation. It just feels no good. Big deal. Yeah, I can do it. Even if I don't want to do that thing, it's just no big deal. So what the hell, right? It's an easy thing to do, but it can take a little bit of time to figure out, especially for the horses that haven't moved for a long time, how to turn the brain on. But it's also follows, it's a complex biological system, right? So it follows nonlinear rules. So that's why people can go, God, I've been working at this, for 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, nothing's happened. But then the next day can change everything. Because, neuroplasticity, it can happen overnight. Capacity will take longer, but you can make changes to the brain's map very, 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 very quickly. And most initial strength gains are also coming from rewiring of neural pathways, not actual muscle tissue changes. That takes a much longer period of time. But meanwhile, they've gained, or humans, right, have gained all of this extra strength. So we can take advantage of that. But it's just that we don't know, nobody knows, what is the thing that's going to flip that switch for that particular, animal. And so having a very experimental, exploratory, it's just about doing something novel that we didn't do before. Because novelty also helps provoke the brain to say, oh, this is interesting. I should pay attention to this. Maybe this is worth, synthesizing a few proteins because we haven't seen this before. So without fear, but challenge without threat. That's kind of the mantra, is that how can you challenge them to the point that, we challenge the horses a lot, but it has to be where their brain does not perceive a threat. Because once it perceives a threat, then it's going to start to close down options. And that's when you see a lot of well-trained horses, but their movements are very fragile. So they're doing the same movement they've been trained to do, and they do it really well, but there's no variability in how they do it. So the moment they're on different footing, right, injury. Or the moment they move in some unusual way, injury, because they've got all this repetitive stress. And for sport horses, that's still considered by far the most common type of injury is considered a cumulative microtrauma. But it doesn't feel like it to the human. To the human, it feels like he was going fine and suddenly he blew a tendon, right? But the veterinarians are like, that tendon didn't just blow. It was coming for a long time. So the more novelty and exposure to other movements, then the horse starts to become really robust. So if we're training in this way to narrow their movements, basically they get the same profile of movement as people in pain, right? Where people in pain have very low variability in their movements. They move they protect right, certain parts of their body. So a lot of classical training is actually doing that. It's actually training them to have what was used to be seen as healthy movement, but it's not, because it's reducing all of that robust variability in the movement. It's constraining it to this one technique of movement. So we're saying, let's do the opposite. Let's expose the horses to everything. Which, they would get on a nice big open ranch,
Oh, yeah.
For me, I think part of my a real eye-opener was, my horses are all Icelandic. And some of them actually came from Iceland, some were born here. But the first time I went to Iceland, just driving from the airport, right, in the taxi, and I'm seeing these horses, right, because of course that's all they have are the Icelandic horses. And these horses just moving on the side of the road and, out in pastures. And every one of them looked spectacular to me. They all looked like world class. And my husband and I are like, wow, this must be some famous competition breeding barn, right? And the taxi driver just laughed. And he's like, no, those are horses. Those are just horses. And he just couldn't get over the fact that they looked so unusual to me in their movements. Their movements were so big and free and spirited, but it's like that's how they're born and live. They live mostly wild, their first 3 to 4 years. And then they're turned out every year to live basically wild, where no one sees them for months. And they have this incredibly difficult terrain, and their movements are so robust, and they love to move, even though they are, sort of by nature kind of energy savers, right? I mean, these are northern easy keeper horses, but movement is just such a part of them because of that environment. And then I would see the same horses come to the United States and live in a sort of normal, stable lifestyle, including mine, and they just slowly start to lose all that. And people used to go, Is it something in the water? What is it that causes them to lose all this movement? And it's like the most obvious thing that we weren't paying attention to, because they're not moving that way. Oh. So my goal has been, how can I sort of recreate that, even if I am in a flat pasture and a fairly small facility, and maybe all I have is when I started this, all I had was basically a small arena. So it's like, what can I introduce into the environment to bring back all of that unusual movement? And that's part of what the chasing the bag did, right? It suddenly caused a whole bunch of novel movements that I couldn't possibly have asked the horse to do. Mm. And then the other thing I use is the little gymnastics mat, the 2-inch thick gymnastics mat. Because just standing on it, walking across it, doing some carrot stretches, right? They can't really lock themselves on it. It's not very unstable, just a little, just enough. And you can kind of, you can do like big like massage or withers rocking and tail rocking, or sometimes I'll even like push them over and just enough so that their brain is like, oh, I can't do my normal bracing.
Yeah.
And so it just suddenly fires a whole bunch of extra things. Oh, and it's those little, walking over, putting different kinds of rocks on their, pasture. Bring in 2 different kinds of wood chips. Just tiny, small places. Even if they only take 2 steps over something with different footing. It's like a proprioception garden could be done, in a size of 2 stalls, just by having 5 different things they have to step on.
I love that. We have to close up, which I could talk to you all day, Kathy, honestly, because this has been something I just moved my girls, and we've been trying to create diversity in the environment. And so I'm constantly like piling up logs and putting out tires and just trying to, make it interesting for their movement, right? So I really appreciate that. Before we close up today, Kathy, I would love to hear, is there any main resource that you're really loving right now, or anything that you are finding really helpful for you at the moment?
There's a book out so there's 2 books that I think are really great. There's a new one out, but it's written for kind of everyone, not academics in movement. It's written more for sort of human movement coaches, but it's the most close thing that represents the actual science of movement that we use, and it's called How We Learn to Move by Rob Gray.
Okay.
So Rob, R-O-B as in boy, Gray. So How We Learn to Move, that's a new book. And like I said, it's the closest thing for people who actually want to understand some of the science of movement, even though it's written for anyone to read. Yep. So it's only a little bit geeky compared to what the other books up until this point are much more academic. And then there's another author called Todd Hargrove, and it might be two D's, I can't remember, but Todd Hargrove, and he has 2 books, and one I think is called Better Movement, and the other one is called Playing with Movement. And those are written not necessarily for movement professionals. How We Learn to Move is written for people who help others move. Playing with Movement and Better Movement are written just for anybody. And they also are really good. Those are very awesome. Easy, friendly books. Even if English is not your first language, I can't recommend those books enough. Amazing. So those are 2 I think that are great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. So how do people get in touch with you, Kathy? How do they access this amazing course that you do? Yeah.
The social media that I'm on is Instagram under Panther Flows with an S, because I couldn't, even though the name is really Panther Flow, but that was not available. So Panther Flows on Instagram is where I am. And then the website, you can either go to intrinzen.com and it'll get you there, or pantherflow.com. And I have one course right now. I'm working on a new course, but the new course is for instructors of humans, not instructors of horses. But the pain science course, there are 3 free videos on an intro to pain science. And I think if people just watch the 3 free videos, you don't necessarily get some of the other techniques, but you get the whole idea from those videos of why pain science matters, and how it works and what's changed and what's important. So to me, those are I think a good resource for people.
Great.
Because there are other resources on pain science, but in this case I used examples of horses. And then the course is Pain Science and Performance for Horse Owners.
Wonderful.
And that's on the same page where you can link to the free ones. And that's just open all the time. That's just a self-serve course. But it's a big course.
Yeah, it looks incredible. I will link up those links onto my wholehorse.ca page. So anybody who's listening on iTunes or Spotify, you can head over there, and I'll have the books that Kathy recommended as well as her links to her Instagram and her website. And I think I'm going to go sign up for your course, honestly.
I know, I can recommend something else, because the community is really just kicking ass and so incredibly helpful for other people. So, the course is not very expensive, but you could, if you were willing to take the time, you could just get most of it from watching what people say over time on social media. So following the hashtag Intrinzen is a great way. And also people have different hashtags for the course, but it's such a long, ridiculous name. But just hashtag Intrinzen or Intrinzen inspired, you can start to find people in the community who post a lot of examples with every possible kind of horse. And I learn a lot from how other people are doing things, because that's what it takes creativity and novelty, right? And I'm not the most creative person. So seeing other examples of what people do just gives you different things to try. And that's really the answer, is try all the things and then go back and try all the things you tried before that didn't work, because now they might. You never know, right? Just be an explorer.
I love it. What a great way to end today. Thank you so much, Kathy.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you're doing. Having resources like this is so great.
You are welcome. I want to keep doing it, because getting to chat with people like you is a dream come true. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so honored. All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. We really appreciate it. We'll chat with you soon.
I've enjoyed some amazing sessions with podcast listeners and their horses over the last several months, and connected with people around the world and horses and horse herds. And I'm very, very grateful for this opportunity. If you'd like to connect with me for a session, you're always welcome to reach out, alexa@alexalinton.com. And if you ever have a podcast guest that you'd love to hear from, just message me and I will try to get them on. Thanks again for listening. It's been a pleasure. I love hearing from each and every one of you about what you're learning and what's changing for you and your horses. So thank you for that. It fills my heart. Okay, have a great day. Bye for now.